Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Book Club of California live online program titled Monster, She Wrote. It's going to be a live online program, and we will be getting started in just a moment or so. We have quite a large number of folks registered for this event. We're going to give them a couple of minutes here to get in from the waiting room. So just sit back, relax, and be patient. We will be starting shortly. Thanks. Good evening. If you've just joined us and you're here for the Book Club of California's live online program titled Monster, She Wrote, you're in the right place. So just sit back, relax, be patient for just another moment. We will be getting started soon. Thanks. All right, it's a few minutes past the top of the hour, and we do still have people coming in from the waiting room. They're slowly trickling in, but we're going to get started anyway, and they can join us in progress. So good evening, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled Monster, She Wrote. This is a live presentation by Dr. Melanie R. Anderson and Dr. Lisa Kroger. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host the webinar this evening. Tonight, we have more than 120 people registered for this presentation, so for those of you who might be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, history, scholarship, and much more. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work that we do without the support of our members. I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the book club. And now for tonight's program and our presenters. The program title up there on your screen is Monster, She Wrote. It is a live presentation by Dr. Lisa Kroger and Dr. Melanie R. Anderson. Lisa Kroger is a Stoker and Locus Award-winning writer who lives on the Gulf Coast, where she enjoys a life of reading, writing, and all things horror. Sometimes she uses her PhD in Gothic literature to teach, but mostly she uses it to write horror in all formats: fiction, nonfiction, podcasts, and screenplays. She's an active member of the Horror Writers Association and the NYX Horror Collective, a group focused on women-created genre content for film, television, and new media. Most recently, she produced 13 Minutes of Horror, Folklore, which streamed on Shudder. Melanie R. Anderson holds a PhD in American literature from the University of Mississippi. She is an assistant professor of English at Delta State University in Cleveland, Mississippi, where she teaches courses in American literature. She researches and writes about American Gothic and supernatural literature, which occasional forays into pop culture, I should say. Now, together, Lisa and Melanie are hosts for the No Fear cast and the Monster She Wrote podcast. And they have co-authored Monster She Wrote, The Women Who Pioneered Horror and Speculative Fiction. Now, this multi-award-winning book is part biography and part reader's guide with engaging write-ups and detailed reading lists that explore more than 100 authors and over 200 of their mysterious and spooky novels, novellas, and stories. So Frankenstein was really just the beginning. Horror stories and other weird fiction wouldn't exist without the women who created it. From Gothic ghost stories to psychological horror to science fiction, women have been primary architects of speculative literature of all sorts. And their own life stories are as intriguing as their fiction. Now tonight, Lisa and Melanie will introduce us to some of the women writers who defied convention to craft some of literature's strangest tales, from Frankenstein to The Haunting of Hill House and beyond. And I love that we're able to present this talk during National Women's History Month too. So if you have any questions for our presenters, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time toward the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those questions from the chat and the Q&A. Okay, enough of me. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Melanie Anderson and Lisa Kroger and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for that. That was a great introduction to us and our book. All right, so, generally when we start this kind of talk, I feel like I need to preface it by saying, or by kind of telling how we met and how this book came about. Mel and I met when we were in graduate school. We both went to the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi, and we were office mates. So we spent long hours together in an office in a probably haunted building on campus. It was a office that, because we were graduate students, we spent a lot of time there reading and writing and doing our own research. We also spent quite a lot of time waiting for students who never showed up for their conferences. And because of that, we got to talk quite a bit about things that were interesting to us. Now, I've always loved horror. I've loved horror in all its formats. My grandmother, when I was probably about 4 or 5 years old, used to show me old Vincent Price movies. And from that moment, I was absolutely enamored with the genre. So it's always been something that I've enjoyed. Talking with Melanie, I realized that not everybody shared this love, but I was determined. I was absolutely determined to prove to her that she did enjoy horror, because she would always talk to me about these great ghost stories. She really enjoyed reading Victorian ghost stories. She absolutely loved weird tales. And I was like, there's a lot of horror genre crossover in those stories. And so we began talking about it a little bit. We also began talking about how there must be more women who were writing around the time. Because, of course, growing up, I read Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King. I used to read all of them. I didn't read many women until I became older and started seeking them out. And that was really the genesis of this book. Mel, I'm probably leaving something out. If you can fill in the blanks there.
Well, I don't think I can add too much to your tale there that you told. Yeah, I mean, we were graduate students together. We both had dissertations that were using the supernatural in some way. Lisa was writing her dissertation on women writers of the Gothic in the 1700s, like capital G Gothic, basically. And I was writing about ghosts and Toni Morrison's fiction. And yeah, Lisa's right. Like when I was growing up, my mom was really into kind of classic horror movies. She was also a big Godzilla fan. So, I mean, I watched a lot of creature features and things like that, but I did not watch a lot of horror movies otherwise. I really wasn't into slashers and things like that. And I just kind of had compartmentalized some of the things that I was into that now I realize are horror. They're just subgenres of horror, away from saying like, I'm not a horror fan. So yeah, I think by talking to Lisa and kind of seeing the connections, I realized I was into this stuff. And through the podcast, I've actually kind of expanded some of my interests in horror as well. Let me see. I guess there's nothing else I can really add, except that was, Lisa met me at a time in my life when I was obsessed with Shirley Jackson. So that also, I think, played a role into the way that we started looking for women writers of horror. So I was a big fan at the time of The Haunting of Hill House, not necessarily the 1990s movie, but I had read the book because the movie was out and I was very excited about it. And so I came into grad school wanting to read a bunch on Shirley Jackson and discovered along with Lisa that at the time there wasn't a lot published on her. That's changed, but that got us thinking, like, are there other women writers in this genre that people just aren't paying attention to? And if so, what could we do to bring more attention to that? And so we originally had talked about, I think we talked about maybe like websites or blogs, and we did the podcast No Fear Cast, and so we were like, no, we want something where we're bringing attention to these women writers and how they've been there since the beginning of horror. And that's kind of where Monster, She Wrote the book came from. We had kind of a basic idea that we wanted to bring some of these writers to people's attention who may not be aware of them. And we were lucky enough to be at a Bram Stoker horror convention and to meet someone from Cork who also was interested in what we were interested in. And that's how this book, Monster, She Wrote, came to be with Quirk Books. So the first thing that we're going to do before we introduce you to some of these women is I am going to read part of our introduction and then pass it off to Lisa, and she'll finish the introduction to the book. And that should give you all a feel for some of the things we were thinking about when we put the book together and how we see it connecting. And then we'll pass back and forth between each other some stories about some of the women in this book to hopefully answer some of your questions that you may have, or maybe get you thinking about stuff you may want us to talk about in the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and begin reading. Why are women so great at writing horror fiction? Maybe because horror is a transgressive genre. It pushes readers to uncomfortable places where we aren't used to treading, and it forces us to confront what we naturally want to avoid. And women are accused of being transgressive all the time, or at the very least, they are used to stepping outside of the carefully drawn boundaries that society has set for them. Women are told what to do and who to be. Women are taught to be sweet, to raise children, to stay in their place. Women are pushed to the edges of society where they are expected to keep their mouths shut and their heads down. The marginalization of women may have been more overt in the past, at times when women couldn't vote or own property or work outside the home, but it still happens today. Women are still instructed to be good girls. In any era, women become accustomed to entering unfamiliar spaces, including territory that we've been told not to enter. When writing is an off-limits act, writing one story becomes a form of rebellion and taking back power. Consider, for example, Margaret Cavendish, who in the 1600s brazenly wrote about science and philosophy, two subjects then considered the purview of only male minds. More recently, Joel Gomez brought an African-American and lesbian perspective to the vampire tale, which had long been the province of European male protagonists. And today, writers like Carmen Maria Machado and Helen Oyeyemi subvert the so-called safe storytelling formats of the fairy tale and the supernatural yarn, adding women's voices to these traditional narrative forms.
For women especially, writing is often a kind of non-compliance, which calls to mind the prisoners in the comic book series Bitch Planet by writer Kelly Sue DeConnick and artist Valentine DeLandro. The comic is brilliant. It tells a female-driven dystopian story about women sent to a prison planet as punishment for being non-compliant. What a great word to describe the women in this book. The writers you'll meet in Monster, She Wrote are all rule breakers. And here's the funny thing. Society doesn't always pay attention to what's happening over there on the edges. So while society was ignoring them, they were taking up their pens. While everyone else has been doing their own thing, women have been doing theirs, crafting tales about scientifically reanimated corpses, ghosts of aborted children, post-apocalyptic underground cities. Horror has been penned by men and women alike, but it's important to acknowledge that women have been contributing to the genre since its inception. And you'll discover in our pages, the horror genre that readers love today would likely be unrecognizable without the contributions of these women, these misbehaving women who write horror in all its nasty forms. So one of the things we noticed when we were beginning to think about putting this book together is when you asked just a general reader about women in horror, usually two names would get thrown back to us. We would get Mary Shelley, because most people recognize Frankenstein as being, really one of the most recognizable beginnings to what we consider the horror genre, and to some degree, the science fiction genre too. So most people know Mary Shelley and recognize her contributions. And now Shirley Jackson. Now, Mel mentioned that when we really started our scholarship on Shirley Jackson, there wasn't much criticism on her. There certainly hadn't been too many film adaptations on her work. There were notably two versions of The Haunting of Hill House at the time we began writing. But we've seen kind of an explosion of her work and a recognition of her contribution to the genre since then, but really we were not hearing any other names. Those were the two that were most common. And I found that really fascinating because even if you look at Mary Shelley, which a lot of people pinpoint as the beginning, Margaret Cavendish was writing in the 1600s, well before the women who pioneered the Gothic novel, or even Mary Shelley herself. Now, Margaret Cavendish is really fascinating. We're not going to go too far into her story, but just to kind of give you an idea, she was writing what I would consider speculative fiction, but definitely sprinkled with horror at the time, primarily as an expression of her own ideas on philosophy and science, which it was unheard of at the time for a woman to have ideas on those subjects. It wasn't common, in fact, really at all for anybody to be educated, for any woman to be educated in those subjects. So the fact that she was educated, that she did read on those subjects, and that she wrote about them is pretty transgressive in and of itself, pretty rebellious in and of itself. And just kind of to give you an idea of Margaret Cavendish as a character in and of herself, she wanted people to notice her, not only for her ideas, but also for her literary celebrity, which she definitely tried to get people to recognize her as a literary celebrity. To that point, she actually went, this is really famous, it was written up by historians of the day, she went to the opera and made sure that her dress came just below her breasts, and then very thoughtfully put some bright red tassels to cover. But she wanted everybody to talk about her, and they did. And, see, they called her Mad Madge, by the way, which I think is kind of funny. But when you think about, because we get this question a lot, especially now that we've written this book, why women in particular would be great at writing horror or would be attracted to the genre. I think it's because in and of itself, it is breaking rules, and that is what it aims to do. And that's what these women wanted to do as well. So the first woman that we really want to talk about is Margaret Oliphant. She was writing in the 1800s. She's one of these women who was really writing when the ghost story was having its heyday. But just a little bit about her. She was an extremely prolific writer. You may have read some of her stuff. She wrote more than 120 works, that's novels and short stories, mostly over the latter half of the 1800s. I think one of the reasons that we don't hear about Margaret Oliphant more today is because she did write genre. So she was writing what was considered entertainment for the masses. And she did this very intentionally. But I think because of that, because she was not writing for literary merit in and of itself, It's what we might call the penny dreadful syndrome. Anything that was written for the masses was considered not literary, like it shouldn't be saved, it shouldn't be documented, it shouldn't be written about later. So it was largely forgotten. It was consumed and then forgotten. But she did publish regularly in Blackwood's magazine. Blackwood's magazine was notable for publishing the work of Percy Bysshe Shelley and Sir Walter Scott. So she was publishing and writing, I mean, among the greats of her day. I certainly would consider her the greats. I would personally rather read her than anything by Sir Walter Scott, but that may just be my personal preference. So a little bit about her background. Her husband died of tuberculosis in 1859, leaving her to take care of 3 children. It was really quite tragic. She had 6 children, 3 died in infancy. So she had the other 3 to take care of when her husband died. And she was also supporting other members of her family. So she had nieces and nephews that relied upon any income that she brought in. Her brother was unfortunately an alcoholic and couldn't bring in any money. And so she ended up taking in his family. And she was able to do that solely on publishing her stories and her novels, which is pretty remarkable. That women were able, this was a career that was really open to them. Probably her most famous story, and one that is still anthologized today, is The Open Door. It is about a ghostly child on a snowy winter night at a lonely manor house. So it's about as a Victorian ghost story as you can get. Imagine some creepy old English manor. It's very cold, very snowy, very dark outside. And the fires are just starting to dwindle down at night when somebody hears a ghost child at the door saying, oh, mother, let me in." So she did tend to write these kinds of ghost stories. I don't think they would really be what we would consider, a horror today, especially if you look at some of the movies that rely on gore or jump scares. Her work was much more quiet, much more atmospheric, but still very effective. This is a quote from one of her stories, The Lady's Walk. It kind of tells you a little bit about how she wrote. I'll just read it very quickly. "Then it struck me all at once. The lady was away. They told me afterwards that was the worst sign. It is always death that is coming when she goes away." She wrote a lot about ghosts and omens, and I highly recommend seeking her out if you are a fan of that particular type of ghost story.
Okay, I am going to talk a little bit about Pauline E. Hopkins. So Hopkins lived from 1859 to 1930. And according to scholar Richard Yarborough, she was the single most productive Black woman writer at the turn of the century. So she delivered lectures on Black history. She wrote and published fiction, including drama, stories, novels, and nonfiction. And she also was the literary editor of the magazine The Colored American from 1903 to 1904. This was a position that she had basically until Booker T. Washington took over the magazine and put different people in those positions. She actively spoke out against lynching, sexual violence, and imperialism, and she didn't shy away from exploring issues of inequality and oppression in the fiction she was writing either. And in order to talk about these topics in her fiction, she would use popular genres of the day. So she's often seen as a writer who was using the idea of sentimental fiction, which is where you try to build in sympathy for your heroine, but she also was writing detective fiction, like her locked room mystery story, Talma Gordon. She wrote romance, adventure, and stories tinged with Gothic tropes. Her recently re-released novel, so this was a novel that was serialized during her lifetime, but then was out of print for a while, is Of One Blood, or The Hidden Self. It was originally serialized from 1902 to 1903. And there's been a couple re-releases of it, reprintings of this book in the last like 5 years or so. And this one book, Of One Blood, included sentimental romance, mesmerism, spiritualism, ghost hunts, seances with automatic writing, and the last part of it is a Lost World archaeological research trip to Africa. So basically, during this adventure, our main character, who has been kind of unlucky in love and wants to leave America, goes with this archaeological group to try to find this hidden African nation that has been completely untouched by any outsiders and has not been colonized. They find it and they discover that it is, slightly more advanced even than the rest of the world. And, I've talked to my students about this before, and I've taught Talma Gordon. And when I describe this nation that they discover, my students say that it sounds like Wakanda from the Black Panther. So I guess Pauline Hopkins was kind of anticipating some of the speculative fiction that was to come. It's a fun book to read. I highly recommend it.
All right, well, it is a fun book to read. So our next kind of woman of horror is Daphne du Maurier. Now, I mentioned at the top of this that when we used to talk to people about women writing horror prior to putting this book together, usually they mentioned Mary Shelley. Sometimes they would mention Shirley Jackson. And that was pretty much the only names we heard. Probably the third most popular was Daphne du Maurier, because a lot of people recognize her for Rebecca, which is arguably one of the most famous Gothic horror novels since the Gothic heyday of the 1790s. And of course, the famous first line, "Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again." And her titles are very recognizable. Rebecca, The Birds. She was one of these that as an adult, I discovered she had the connection to the birds and that it was even based on a short story. I remember watching the film quite a bit as a child. I just loved those older horror movies. And it says it, I think, in the opening credits of it, that it's based on the short story. And somehow I just had never put that together as a kid. But she is famous, I guess, for her work with Alfred Hitchcock and his adaptations of the work. But, I found a lot of people don't really know the woman behind that connection. Like, once you move her away from her connection with Hitchcock, not a lot of people know it. She came from a really famous and interesting family. Her family was always surrounded by art and artists. There was always actors and writers and people who were big into the theater and musicians who came in and out of their house. Her father was a theater critic. Her mother was an actress. And her cousins, I always find this a really fascinating connection, were the Llewellyn Davies boys, who would inspire or go on to inspire the author J.M. Barrie when he wrote Peter Pan. And in fact, J.M. Barrie, the writer, was at Daphne du Maurier's childhood home quite a bit as she was growing up. So that's kind of the type of people that were always there. In her own writing about her childhood, she really describes it as kind of an idyllic time. She loved as a child to create. She was always kind of wrapped up in her own imagination. And she often said, as she got older, because she struggled a little bit as she did get older, and she started to realize that people were going to expect her to live up to, what would have been a well-off young lady, to get married, to have a family. And I think she kind of struggled with making that transition from having this really fantastic imaginative, creative childhood, and then having to fit the role of what was a good woman at that time. And in that struggle, she talked about that she always felt like she had a boy soul that was born into the wrong body. Later, she would call that male spirit that lived within her, which she did connect to her writing and kind of her creativity. She's that spirit within her was what drove her creativity, but she called him lover. And it was something that she talked about quite a bit in her own writings. As she got older, she did marry a man named Frederick Boy Browning, or Frederick Browning. She called him Boy. And she did have some affairs with women that were written about quite a bit. What I find really fascinating, though, is, this marriage and affairs aside, she really fell in love with a manor home in Cornwall called Mina Billy. And they couldn't afford, her and her husband could not afford to actually buy this home. So she basically convinced the people who owned it and who owned the land to let her live there for, she could rent it for some time. And she lived in this home for as long as they allowed her to do that. The house itself was not in great condition. Her children would later talk about how, she would sit up and write in the midst of this house that was quite literally crumbling around her. It was in such bad disrepair that there were parts of the house she couldn't even go into, that had to be blocked off, and there were rats running around, but she loved the place. Just something in it spoke to her. And in fact, you probably know where I'm going with this, but the manor home that she was in love with became Manderley and Rebecca. Even coming down to the idea of parts of the house that you can't go into because they're not being used anymore. So it's really kind of fascinating. She has some short stories that I highly recommend. I already mentioned the birds. There's one called The Doll that was only recently found and republished in one of her collections. In fact, the collection is called The Doll and Other Stories. And it's a really interesting look at how women were using the horror genre to say something, I think, about women's roles, because of course the idea, what it means to be masculine, what it means to be feminine, it changes based on the culture you're in. It changes based on the time period you're in. It's nothing that's the same throughout time. But women, I found through writing horror, are always pushing back against it. So in this story, The Doll, it's essentially about a woman who has her own sexual agency, and in that drives men mad. In the story, the protagonist, the woman, has a doll that she keeps with her, and she has a relationship, a full-on relationship with this doll. And the story is told from her male suitor's point of view. And over the course of the story, he is first confused and then incensed by anger, but then just kind of driven into confusion and madness because he realizes he can't control this woman who he's supposed to be in a relationship with, that she would rather be by herself with this doll. And it just drives him to madness. It's really fascinating. And a lot of criticism is finally, I think, starting to be written about Daphne du Maurier, especially in queer Gothic circles. Looking at Rebecca, for instance, and how that might be read through a queer narrative. So really, really absolutely fascinating things. I pulled this quote from Rebecca, just knowing how she felt about her home in Cornwall. I thought it was quite fascinating. And at midnight, when the children sleep and all is hushed and still, I sit down at the piano and look at the paneled walls, and slowly, softly, with no one there to see, the house whispers her secrets, and the secrets turn to stories, and in strange and eerie fashion, we are one, the house and I.
Yeah, I would add the story, Du Maurier's story, The Blue Lenses, as one of her scariest. I won't say what people
That is a
see through the
great
blue
one.
lenses, but yes, it's terrifying. And Lisa, I will hit my quote this time. I I missed my note on that. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about L.T. Mead, who is another writer of the turn of the century. And L.T. Mead is an interesting person to talk about, I think, because, well, her full name was Elizabeth Thomasina Mead Smith, so you can understand why she used L.T. Mead as her pen name. But she was a prolific writer. Some people cite her as writing about 250 to 280 works total. Now, Lisa and I did not read all of those. But a lot of her work was termed at the time girls fiction. So this would have been books about school children dealing with life. So it could have been something as simple, well, it's not simple, I guess, when you're a child, but making friends, keeping friends, the social things that happen at school. But there could also be very dark things that she would deal with as well, such as children dealing with the death of family members or living through illness at the time. But the thing that we found most interesting about her, and what I've always loved about L.T. Mead, was she had an interest in writing mysteries and detective fiction. But the way she went about doing that was through the supernatural. And so one of the things that I love personally is occult detective fiction. And that was how I stumbled upon L.T. Mead when I was first researching occult detective fiction for something that I was working on with Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. I discovered her book, A Master of Mysteries, which was published in 1898. So this is a collection of stories. She actually wrote with a doctor whose pen name was Robert Eustace. So she would take care of the stories and he would help her with any sort of medical knowledge or scientific knowledge she would need for the murders, etc. In fact, the Eustace actually worked with Dorothy Sayers on one of her books. So he worked with, I'm assuming, other mystery writers as well in that vein. But in A Master of Mysteries, we have John Bell, who's alternately called is usually called the Ghost Breaker. I'm not 100% sure, I guess, because he breaks ghost stories. But it's kind of like an adult Scooby-Doo, I guess. I recently reread this book and it was just so, I find it so interesting because she's basically creating real mysteries, but they're overlaid with supernatural things. So again, like if you think back when you're a kid and you watch Scooby-Doo, like the creepy caretaker makes people think they're ghosts in a house or something to that effect. So there'll be these really grisly crimes, but the person who committed them or someone nearby, there'll be some sort of story or folklore they can play with that makes people think it's supernatural. And so John Bell, who has a lot of money and doesn't need to work and has a lab in his house, goes around investigating these mysteries and showing people that there's probably not something supernatural going on here. It's actually explainable. The other thing that we found most interesting about L.T. Mead was that she had two other short story collections. One was The Brotherhood of the Seven Kings, which came out in 1898 alongside A Master of Mysteries, and The Sorceress of the Strand, which came out in 1902. And The Sorceress of the Strand and The Brotherhood of the Seven Kings, while they are story collections, the stories are in chronological order. And they basically tell the story. Each one, you have a different man who is the protagonist, basically fighting against this female evil mastermind who is basically like Moriarty. So in The Brotherhood of the Seven Kings, you have Madame Colucci. I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce how L.T. Mead would have wanted us to pronounce her name. She's an Italian crime boss, I guess you would say. Like she runs this crime cult group that meets near Mount Vesuvius, and the narrator or the protagonist of the story apparently had a romantic relationship with her at some point, but he tried to escape her clutches and he came to England, and then of course she brings the whole group to England to do a bunch of crimes, so he has to try to fight her. And then The Sorceress of the Strand is about Madame Sarah, and she was called the Sorceress of the Strand because her stories appeared in the Strand magazine. So if you're familiar with the Sherlock Sherlock Holmes stories. They also appeared in the Strand. And Madame Sarah, again, was kind of a female mastermind. She directed like a group of people, but it wasn't maybe as organized as, say, the other woman villain. And so, yeah, I'm just fascinated by the fact that around the same time as, Doyle would have been pitting Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty against each other, we have this woman thinking about what it would be like if you had another woman as your female, your villainous mastermind. And the mysteries are just kind of bizarre sometimes. Like, we have the bees there because, yes, somebody tries to use like poisonous insects at one point to kill someone surreptitiously, and they're entertaining. All right, so this particular quote is from The Mystery of the Felwyn Tunnel, which is where basically people keep seeing something weird in the tunnel and they go to look at it and bad things happen to them. And John Bell has to come figure out if there's something supernatural luring them into the tunnel, or if there's maybe a disgruntled train employee. The whole thing is the most absolute enigma. Some of the country folk have declared that the tunnel is haunted, that Pritchard saw some apparition and in wild terror sought to escape from it by climbing the rocks, is another theory, but only the most imaginative hold it.
All right, moving on to Margaret St. Clair. So this is my last one, and then Mel will have one more woman that she introduces you to. But Margaret St. Clair, I think, is really special to both of us because she was really the start of this book. Mel had been the one to really kind of prompt me to read Margaret St. Clair. She was a writer that I hadn't heard of. This was back when we were in graduate school. And she was like, oh yeah, you really like horror. I really think you would like Margaret St. Clair. And we started kind of digging into her background as the years went on, because we were curious about who she was. And it was her backstory that I think really, really prompted us to write this, because I thought, man, her backstory is almost as fascinating as the books itself that she writes. So Margaret St. Clair was, I would call her a pulp writer who was writing in the 50s and 60s. That was when she was publishing primarily. And she wrote these kind of sci-fi horror pulp mashups that appeared in various magazines. And she's a little bit of I think one of these hidden figures in our pop culture history, because if you don't know her name, I guarantee you have at least seen some of her work out in the world. And that's because if you've ever heard of Dungeons and Dragons, the role-playing game, then you know some of her work. In fact, she appeared in the 1979, her name did, in the 1979 Dungeon Master's Guide, as one of the inspirations. Specifically, her books, The Shadow People and Sign of the Labyrinth, was mentioned by the game designer, Gary Gygax, when he was putting it together, because he was really inspired by her lore, particularly kind of going to this fantasy world underneath the ground and meeting these fantastical creatures. So her work really was kind of plucked from obscurity, I would say, at the time. This was in 1979 when the Dungeon Master's Guide was published. And people, I think, really at that time didn't really know who she was. Certainly maybe in the 50s and 60s more so, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Margaret St. Clair was born in Kansas. She was born and raised by her family in the Quaker faith. It was something that was very important to her. But later she moved to California to go to university. She met her husband there, kind of set up a life there. And as she started writing, she was becoming increasingly interested in a new kind of religion that she was hearing about, specifically Wicca, and how women were using witchcraft in their day, men and women, but primarily women. And she was really fascinated by this. And as a writer, she wanted to write about witchcraft, but she wanted to make sure that she portrayed it in an accurate light. So she went and essentially lived among the Wiccans in California to learn about this for her stories. And it's really fascinating, because if you think about what people would have associated with witchcraft during that time, I mean, it's hard to escape the Wicked Witch of the West, of course, probably one of the most famous ones. So, but then you were also having these, these like housewife witches in pop culture around the mid-century. And she wanted to make sure that, the women who were witches in her story were smart and were capable and were strong, and that she was portraying this kind of religion as accurately as she could. So she did that. She actually ended up becoming very interested in it. And so she was kind of out there in California living her Quaker Wiccan life as a writer. So I've mentioned the Shadow People, the Sign of the Labyrinth. The Sign of the Labyrinth has probably most of her research for Wicca in it. One of my favorite, I prefer her short stories personally. I love Sign of the Labyrinth, but I think she really excelled when she was writing these kind of weird horror adjacent short stories. One in particular was The Man Who Sold Rope to the Knolls. It is absolutely one of my favorite stories of hers. It's one of my favorite short stories of kind of the Weird Tales era period. And I think I like it so much because it's a very grounded story, for as strange as it is. It's about a man who is a salesman. And at the beginning of the story, all he wants to do is impress his boss. He wants to go out and make a sale that is so impressive that he will get kind of a standing ovation at the company dinner later. That's really what is driving him, is that he'll get this kind of corporate applause. And so he goes into the forest because he hears that there are these creatures called the Knolls, which are kind of a cross between like gnomes and trolls, basically. They're these really horrid, they smell bad. They're very ornery, they'll kill you very easily. They're very easily offended if you don't follow their ways. And he thinks, you know what? Nobody ever goes out and talks to these Knolls in the woods. And I bet that they probably could use some rope, and I'm going to go sell it to them. Like, I'm going to be the man to sell them this thing that I think they need. And so he goes out there and he's doing really well. As he's making this sales pitch to these like fantasy horror creatures. Of course, it all goes awry by the end, but it's a really fun story. And it kind of shows her, I think, her sense of humor, which I think is really fascinating. I will mention, because this is fun too, one of her short stories was adapted for television, her short story Brenda, in Rod Serling's Night Gallery. So that's always a very fun thing to go look up. And here is a quote from one of her stories, Horror House. From the sedan, there came a wild burst of shrieking. It was like the flopping, horrified squawks of a chicken at the chopping block. And again, you can just tell she had fun writing these kind of stories, and they're a lot of fun to read.
Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about Jewel Gomez, who is a contemporary writer. She's still writing today. She is, well, I guess she's best known in the horror community for her book, The Gilda Stories, which is a vampire story. But I'll give a little bit of background about her. So she has been an activist since college when she was involved in the civil rights movement. And then she spent her life deeply connected to the gay rights movement as well. And then her vampire novel, The Gilda Stories, which is, you can look at it as a collection of stories, but the stories are all interconnected and they're chronological. So it's usually seen as a novel. It was originally published in 1991. This novel took her interest and completely kind of reimagined what we think of as the traditional vampire type. So if you're thinking like Bram Stoker's Dracula or Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula, that's not what Gomez was doing in her book. So her protagonist, vampire Gilda, is a Black woman and she is a lesbian. And Gomez also includes a sweeping historical view in her novel / collection of stories, however you want to look at it. At the very beginning of the book, Gilda's very young. I think she's very young. I'm thinking like 6 years old or something, and she maybe a little bit older, and she's escaping a plantation. So she's in Mississippi, and she ends up experiencing violence on her way trying to escape, and she runs into these two women from Louisiana who rescue her, and they are vampires. And then the book follows her the rest of her life, and I believe the last story takes place in 2050. So I want to say like 2020 was even mentioned at some point. And so it takes you from, you know, the 1800s basically up to past where we are now. Some of the stuff she imagined the future was really interesting, and I was like, oh, that was cool. Some of it didn't happen yet, I guess. We'll just say that. But it is a fascinating look at placing a character like this in like that kind of sweep of history. Along the way, we learned that these vampires, for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, desire some form of community. They're not loners. Some of them are, but it comes to a bad end. Basically, the idea is that you want to find community, whether that's with humans or vampires or both. Her vampires are less predatory, and rather than taking lives to slake their thirst, they view blood as a shared gift. And so they try to give a gift in return to the person from whom they take the blood, which is, I guess, in some ways a little bit similar to what Octavia Butler was thinking in like Fledgling. Gomez was actually inspired to write this vampire story when she was in a phone booth in New York City when she was younger, and two men came up to the phone booth and were yelling at her, harassing her, and threatening her. And she was just terrified that she was like alone and she didn't want to get out of the phone booth, and she just kind of lost it and started screaming at them. And they basically kind of seemed shocked by this, and they told her that she was overreacting, that they hadn't actually done anything that would require that kind of a response. And she was like totally scared, and you can understand why. I went home and started thinking about, you know, what it would be like if you had, say, ultimate supernatural power and an immortal life, but you still had to choose to live in a country that could be hostile toward your gender, your racial, your sexual identity. And so that got her thinking about a character like Gilda, because no matter where Gilda goes or where she kind of makes her home, she's always got to take that Mississippi dirt with her from the place that she escaped, because she's a vampire and she has to have a piece of the earth or a piece of her home with her. So it's really interesting kind of questions about what home means, you know, what immortality can mean, how does one create community. This is a fascinating book. And it's been reprinted since 91. And Gomez has said recently, at least in a panel I saw, and I think, Lisa, you said you saw her say this as well in another panel, that she is working on a possible sequel for Gilda. And there's at least one story that wasn't included in the original novel that you can find. I want to say it's in the anthology Dark Matter. If you're interested, Chicago 1927, I think is the title of it. But yeah, if you're interested in vampires, you can't go wrong with the Gilda story. It's just a fascinating portrayal. Murder was as much a part of their hunger as the blood. The fire of fear in the blood of others was addictive to some who became weak with the need for the power of killing.
All right, we are reaching the end of our kind of tour through some of the women. I like to emphasize that this is only like a tiny sliver of what's in the book, and our book is a tiny percentage of the women in history and writing today who are building up this genre. So we always like to end kind of our presentation by saying, you know, if horror is something that you enjoy, if science fiction, if speculative fiction is something you enjoy, and you're not reading women, then go out and find some, because you might find your new favorite author. You know, use this as kind of a guide and a jumping off point, but this is not comprehensive. Our book is not comprehensive. And, you know, we just like to kind of put that challenge out there to people to go out there and try to read some women in the horror genre. Thank you for listening.
Okay, I'm back. So first of all, I just got to say thank you so much for sharing your love of horror with us, and for sharing the stories of these fascinating women. I mean, 1, 2, 3, 4, you did 6, but there's, like you said, many more in the book. And now I just need to like read the whole book and look at some of these other ones. I'm now a total fan of Margaret Oliphant. I have to totally check, you know, I'm into ghost stories and omens and all that kind of thing. So I will look that up. And of course, you know, as Mel said, who isn't interested in vampires? I mean, come on, there's
Right.
you got to be interested in vampires. And then that just makes you want to go read Jewel Gomez's work, which is terrific. I'm going to ask folks, if you haven't had a chance to put something in the chat, now's the time to do it, because I'm going to ask some of the questions from the chat and Q&A, or some of the questions that were sent to me that I wrote down on my little piece of paper here. So we have about 10 minutes or so, and we'll do a nice little conversation about you guys and the book and some of these women authors. I think one of the great questions that is in the chat, and someone also said to me, is, are there any common like characteristics among all of these women, or many of these women, aside from their intelligence, right? Like clearly they're all brilliant women, great writers. Did they have other kind of characteristics in common? Any threads between many of them that you can pull out for us?
You know, I was impressed by how many of them were writing, not only because it was something they enjoyed to do, like, but it was something that they had to do. Like, it was filling a need, because, and maybe this is cynical of me, but today I almost want to laugh when I hear that somebody turns to magazine writing and writing short stories because they had mouths to feed at home. Because I feel like it's completely the opposite now. Like, there's no way I could just sit at home and write short stories and support like a family of 4. You know, that's just, but throughout history, that was a career that women were afforded. And so that was something that went on. And even like Shirley Jackson would talk about how, you know, like the refrigerator at home would break. And so she would go and turn and write a story and then get the payment from it and then go and buy a new refrigerator. So that was something that I found really fascinating, is that in a time when not a lot of careers were available to women, you know, they were able to turn their stories into money, which was kind of fascinating.
Yeah, and then that's, you know, usually at a time when it was hard for women to work in other, careers as well. But writing and editing was something that was open to, like, if you're thinking the 19th century. I completely agree with that. I also think that, I mean, I don't know if I can say there's like one theme or something that runs through all women writers of horror, because there are women writing different types of horror, and every woman is different and has different experiences. But I do think there are things that all women understand, or when you're reading, you can be like, okay, I can identify with that possibly you could pinpoint throughout all the writing. I mean, particularly if you look at different segments, like if you think of the women who are writing ghost stories in the 19th century, yes, they're entertaining ghost stories and they can be kind of scary and chilling, but they often deal with stuff that if you read it really carefully, there's usually a tragedy or a real fear going on there that they're trying to communicate. I mean, murdered women coming back for revenge were usually murdered by men for various reasons that kind of show their powerlessness. Women often would tell ghost stories to kind of talk about abuse in homes that they couldn't talk about otherwise. There's often kind of economic or class issues sometimes in the manor houses that were haunted. Edith Wharton did that a lot in her ghost stories. So yeah, I think, the idea of like trying to find a will or something like that, that women were often in positions where they kind of lacked power, they were marginalized, and these women writing these ghost stories could try to tell these stories that if you read them carefully, sometimes there's like a little kernel of really scary truth that's going on in there. And I think you kind of see that, even now in the 21st century, you could be reading a horror story or a book and there's something in it that I think you could identify with in a way. So yeah, I don't know if we could pick out like specific themes that work for whatever time, but I do think women who are in a specific time period often will write about things that maybe if they wrote a realistic novel about it, people might not want to pay attention as much.
Right. Yeah, well, I think that is the common theme. They found a way to express whatever inspired them to talk about whatever that issue was that they wanted to get out there. That's so interesting. And many of them were able to make a living doing that when they couldn't make a living in other areas. That's just so fascinating. There is a question about the illustrations for the book. You had those nice little illustrations next to each portrait. Can you tell us a little bit about those and how they came about or who did them?
Yeah, it's an artist. Her name is Natalia Balnova. In fact, I will be glad to drop her name in the chat. But she is a working artist today. She did all of the illustrations for the book, and they are just absolutely fascinating. And yeah, she sells a lot of her prints on her website. So I would highly recommend checking her artwork out.
Yeah, they're really great. All those little sketches, and they're just terrific. How accessible are some of these works for someone who might want to collect, the horror genre from women authors? Can you find these like in bookstores or book fairs or?
We tried really hard if we were recommending something to know that you could find it. But yeah, there are, it can be difficult sometimes to find some of this stuff, but I I might be wrong, Lisa, and things change. Now, was it just since the book came out, like when Monster Spirit was coming out, like right afterward, a new collection of Margaret St. Clair's stories came out, which is great. A Hole in the Moon, I think it is, edited by Ramsey Campbell. So that's great. So there has been stuff that's kind of come back after the book came out, but when we were writing it, I think we tried hard to be like, okay, we wanted to talk about things that you could find on the internet or you could get used. And, we had to use libraries and interlibrary loan and whatever to get stuff sometimes. And sometimes we couldn't get stuff. So the struggle is real, but we wanted people who read the book to be able to get at least a bit by the writers. And of course we run into the issue sometimes of like when we were researching in 2017 and 18, early like 2016, 17, early 18, like the archives we may have used or something may not be accessible now or maybe different or whatever, but we tried to get as accurate information as we could as to how to find some of this stuff.
Yeah, one of our goals with this was that, readers who read the book could then go out and read the stories we were talking about, whether it was in print or on an internet archive. And we've been working with Valancourt Books to reprint. Right now we've got, I think, 5 titles out. 4 of them are reprints of older books. There's a Gothic novel, there's a collection of weird tales, women writers. One is a new collection.
I actually have Weird Tales right here.
Tuttle. Yeah. And yeah, so we kept kind of the look through that, but we really wanted to talk about writers that people could go out and read.
Great. So there is a question about mentors, being a mentor to younger or other writers, or if other writers mentored some of these women writers. Did you come across that or any any thoughts on them being mentored or them mentoring like a next generation in any way? Or was even that a thing early on?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess reading each other's work,
Mm,
maybe feeling like you're part of a community, perhaps, but
Mhm.
I'm not sure if we found any mentor relationships. I know some of the weird tale stories writers were in that, Lovecraft circle and writing letter. So a lot of letter writing amongst pulp writers,
mm,
and writing into the magazines and talking about each other's stories. So that could be viewed as a form of mentoring. And
Sure.
revision and editing. They often did that too. So yeah, the like 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s pulp writers. But I don't know, Lisa, can you think of any other?
I can't think. Yeah, you're right in that. As far as like the relationship between the women, I think they were more reading each other's work and inspired by it. I mean, Shirley Jackson or Daphne du Maurier, you can find a lot of women writers who, look to them as inspirations. During the time, there were some male mentors. I mean, of course, very famously, like Percy Shelley with Mary Shelley. Of course, it's debatable whether like the revisions he made to Frankenstein were that great,
Right.
because they had to roll those back a little bit. But like I know Dickens, for instance, at the time was mentoring a lot of these women and was publishing a lot of these women. So there
Elizabeth
were those
Gaskell,
kind of
yeah.
Elizabeth Gaskell, yeah, that's who I was thinking of. So there were those kind of mentor relationships.
How hard was it for the early women writers to find publishers for their work? Because you hear that sometimes, they wrote under a different name, so they wouldn't know they were a woman. And but some of these women were really prolific. I mean, 250. Clearly, there was an interest in her work, and someone wanted to publish it.
Yeah,
That is an interesting question. Well, Lisa, you've talked about Minerva Press, right? That was a Gothic thing.
Yeah, I mean, in the 1790s and the really early 1800s, Minerva Press was publishing primarily only women, with the Gothic novels. I think Minerva may have published a few men, but yeah, most of those were women. You had these like trends throughout history where there were certain stories that were considered female stories. The Victorian ghost story, a lot of women were publishing during that time. So I think it just kind of went in and out of fashion. Even in the pulp magazines, we actually found a couple of people who we thought were women that were going to be really interesting. And when we started peeling back their stories, we realized they were men using female sounding pseudonyms for that reason. So I think it depends on the time period.
I agree. The pulps are an interesting situation because a lot of people talked about how they were using pen names to maybe hide the fact that they were women. But, and I'm still learning about this and still reading about it, but there were a lot of women who wrote for the pulps that just used their name, or if they used a pseudonym, it was because, Margaret St. Clair said, what was it? If she used a pseudonym, it was because she had sent out so many stories, people weren't accepting them because she just had sent out too many Margaret St. Clair stories, right? So she had a pen name that was a woman's pen name that she would use so that she could publish more stories. And so, Everil Worrell, I think, used a pen name once, and people knew it was Everil Worrell because it was like an anagram of her name. So they didn't seem too upset about it. I was reading an interview recently with Gray Laspina, and she had joked that she didn't have any trouble. Like, this was something that Margaret St. Clair was also asked, like, did you have trouble publishing as a woman? Both of them were like, no, we had no trouble at all. We got in trouble only because we were trying to publish too much,
Right.
And Laspina joked that she had never received a rejection in her life. So I don't, it seems to me that I'm not saying that women didn't use pseudonyms to get published, but I think it depended on the milieu and the time period and what the audience was. But I've been surprised in some of the research that we've done at how much pseudonym use was just based on personal preference. And I'm wondering if, unfortunately, like closer to our time is when things got really fraught and problematic, which is sad.
Probably not surprising, though. I think you talked a little bit about this, but maybe there's something else you might want to add. There was a question early on, said, did the horror genre become an expression of sexuality and empowerment for women? And you talked a little bit about that, but I don't know if you want to add more.
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely was. I think, you know, I mean, I with sexuality, this is something like Mel just said that I'm just starting to get really into reading more about, like kind of the queer Gothic and queer horror, and how people are like exploring and exploding the idea of gender and sexuality by using it. But I think, yeah, I think they've always kind of used it, you know, as kind of a form of pushback. I keep thinking about all the female villains that women have written over the years, and kind of how much fun that is, and in a way how that kind of pushes the boundaries, because for so long, you know, it's felt like if you're going to write a female character, like she's got to either be the victim or she's got to be the heroine, and you know, to allow a woman to really be kind of mean and nasty on the page is kind of a form of rebellion in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, early on in your opening, you talked about misbehaving women and rule breakers and all that non-compliance. I love that. That's a great way to get us all hooked onto what's coming and what's in the book. So there is, of course, I have to ask the question, what's next for you? Since there were so many women not included in the book, you're doing more. Is there going to be a part 2, or like, how are you getting all these stories out there?
Well, we don't have plans right now for a part 2 book, but Lisa and I are co-hosts of the podcast, the Monster She Wrote podcast. And on that podcast, we occasionally talk about a story or a book that we mentioned in the book, Monster She Wrote, but we've tried to mix in a lot of more contemporary things, or things that we didn't necessarily put into the book. So you get to hear us talk about some of the stuff that's in the book, or some of the stuff that maybe didn't make it into the book. But Lisa, you know, should we talk about our next book project? Should we mention that?
Yeah, I think so. We've got a, I mean, we did really think about kind of, you know, how do we follow this book up? Because we do have so many more women in horror that we could talk about, but we thought we'd veer off just a little bit. And our next book is out in October, and it's called Toil and Trouble, and it's a women's history of the occult. So it's kind of adjacent to horror, but it's looking at how women have used the occult space, kind of in engaging in that space to rebel against patriarchy and misogyny, and, you know, to kind of find their own source of power. So we go from, it's a look at specifically the history of the United States, but we go from the Salem witch trials all the way up through, I mean, pretty much to today. So it's a pretty big swing that we cover, but kind of like Monster She Wrote, we wanted to find women who had really fascinating histories that we thought people hadn't heard before. So,
and when is that out again? In the fall, you said?
In October.
In October. Oh, perfect time to come out.
Just
right?
in time. Yeah.
Just in time for the Halloween season. Oh, wow. That's great. I'm going to look forward to that. And maybe we can have you back to talk a little bit about that as well.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, we'd be happy to do that.
So we're about almost 6:15 is when we usually start to wrap up. I will say that I took a lot of great little quotes. I often do this in some of the talks when somebody says something, the speaker, you know, said, first of all, how do I get the ghost breaker job? Like that is like the best job in the world.
I want to be a ghost breaker. Yeah.
I was gonna say, we've been trying to figure that out all these years.
Who doesn't want to be a ghost breaker? And of course, the adult Scooby-Doo comment was just terrific. And I have some other ones. I won't go into them, but they are great. And I will just wrap up by saying, you know, first of all, thank you so much, you know, Lisa and Melanie. This was really interesting, so fascinating. I hope people are writing that in the chat, fascinating and inspiring. I will send you the comments from the chat, and of course, I'll send you the recording. And if there's any other questions in there that we didn't get to that you want to answer, you know, you and I can talk about those and get them back to the members who asked them. But I'm going to kind of wrap up here and say thank you again so much for doing this. This was so terrific. And I also want to thank everyone out there in the virtual world for attending this Book Club of California program. I hope you'll join us for our next online program. It's titled Collecting Antiquarian Books and the Joy of the Hunt, Classic Book Club Collector Talk. That's going to be Monday, April 18th. You got a couple of weeks for that. We have the big Codex book fair in the Bay Area coming up soon, and we'll be focusing on that. So the next online program is going to be Monday, April 18th at 5 o'clock. And that's going to be a live online presentation by Brattle Bookshop proprietor and Antiques Roadshow appraiser, Kenneth Gloss, right here talking to the book club. You can register for that event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you might be getting from the book club. So go check those out. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Melanie and Lisa. This was terrific. It was great having you here. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Be well and take care of yourself. Bye now.
Thanks. Bye.